Joseph's coat. Joseph's ornate coat was probably made of a rich quality cloth woven with colored threads, as seen in this Egyptian tomb painting of Asians. Their clothes differed from those of the Egyptians, who wore more simple clothes and designs. Dyes. The description of Joseph's coat suggests it was dyed in a range of vibrant shades. These colorful dyes came from natural sources. Red was from the kermes insect, orange from the saffron flower, purple from mollusk shells, and blue from pomegranate rinds. Joseph's dreams. Joseph lived with his father, Jacob, and his brothers in the land of Canaan. Jacob loved all his sons, but Joseph was his favorite. His father had given Joseph a beautiful coat, intricately woven with the colors of the rainbow. Joseph wore it all the time. Everybody knew that he was the apple of his father's eye, and Joseph's brothers hated him for it. One night, Joseph had a dream, and he told his brothers about it. We were binding sheaves of corn out in the field when suddenly my sheaf rose and stood upright. Your sheaves gathered around mine and bowed down to it. His brothers were incensed. So you want to rule us, do you? They jeered. A few nights later, Joseph had another dream, and he foolishly told his brothers about it. This time the sun and the moon and 11 stars were bowing down to me. He also told his father, who was not pleased. What is this dream? Do you think the whole family will actually come and bow down to you? Joseph's brother went to look after their father's sheep and goats in the north of the country. After some days, Jacob asked Joseph to go and see that all was well. When the brothers saw Joseph approaching, they saw their chance. Here comes that little dreamer, they said. Let's kill him and hide him in one of these pits. We'll say a wild animal attacked him. But Reuben, who was a kind man and liked his brother, pleaded with the others. By all means, throw him into the pit, but don't kill him. When Joseph finally reached his brothers, they pounced on him and ripped off his coat. They put him in the pit without any food or water. The brothers sat down to eat their meal that evening, unsure of what to do. And then they saw a caravan of Ishmaelite merchants on the horizon. One of the brothers, who was named Judah, said, Do we really want to kill Joseph? He is our own flesh and blood. Why don't we sell him? Then we'll be rid of him without laying a hand on him. His brothers agreed. So they pulled Joseph out of the pit and offered him to the merchants. A price was agreed, and he was sold and hoisted onto a camel, bound for Egypt. The brothers slaughtered one of the goats and smeared the blood on Joseph's tattered coat before going home. They showed the coat to their father, saying, We found this. Do you think it could belong to Joseph? Jacob recognized the blood-stained bundle and cried, It is my son's coat. An animal has devoured him. And he mourned for his beloved son. Meanwhile, Joseph had reached Egypt. He was sold to Potiphar, one of Pharaoh's most important officials. Traded goods. Ishmaelites were Arabian merchants descended from Abraham's son Ishmael. Slave trading was far less common than the trade of spices and aromatic resins between Arabia and Egypt. Fennel seeds, top, were sold as a medicinal ingredient, while myrrh resin, bottom, was part of the anointing and embalming process for dead bodies. Jacob is grief-stricken when he sees Joseph's bloody coat. Understanding the story. Sibling rivalry leads to Joseph's downfall. His jealous brothers don't like the preferential treatment he receives or the implications of his dreams. When Jacob sees the blood-stained coat, he fears the worst for his favorite son. But the brothers' plan to kill Joseph is in contrast with God's plan for him. Joseph's destiny lies in Egypt, and God is with him. Women in Egypt. The most powerful Egyptian women enjoyed a very high status, reflected in this mural from the tomb of Sennacherib, where Sennacherib's wife, Linferti, is shown as of almost equal stature to him. Women were able to own and manage property and make important decisions. Cupbearer. The pharaoh's cupbearer held a high-ranking and trusted position. His job was to taste the pharaoh's food and drink to ensure they were not poisoned. The pharaoh would have drunk from cups like this typical Egyptian glazed earthenware vessel. Joseph the slave. Joseph, who had been taken to Egypt from Canaan and sold as a slave, worked hard for his new master, Potiphar. The Lord was always by Joseph's side, and Joseph was good at whatever he did. His master, who was captain of Pharaoh's guard and a man of great standing, was impressed. Before long, he made Joseph his own personal attendant and put him in charge of the whole household. Now, Joseph was a very handsome man, and Potiphar's wife took a shine to him. Eventually, her passion running high, she tried to seduce him. Joseph spurned her advances. My master trusts me. How could I betray him? How could I sin against God?" But Potiphar's wife would not take no for an answer, believing herself to be irresistible. Day after day she pursued him, and day after day he refused her. At last, in desperation, she cornered him and tore at his cloak. Terrified, Joseph turned and fled, leaving his cloak in her hands. Scorned and rejected, Potiphar's wife called the servants and told them that Joseph had tried to ravish her. "Look, when I screamed, he left his cloak behind and ran." Then she rushed to tell her husband the story. Potiphar was horrified and ordered Joseph to be thrown into prison. But the Lord watched over Joseph. The prison warder liked the new inmate. Soon, Joseph was put in charge of all the other prisoners, and before long, he was running the place. There were two very special prisoners, the royal baker and Pharaoh's chief cupbearer. Before they were criminals, they had specific duties. The cupbearer had to taste Pharaoh's food and drink in case it was poisoned, and the baker made the household's finest sweetmeats. One morning, while doing his rounds, Joseph saw the two of them sitting in their cells with long faces. He asked what was the matter. "We both had really odd dreams last night," they answered, "but there is nobody who can interpret them." "Tell me your dreams," said Joseph. The chief cupbearer began with this: "I saw a vine with 3 branches. As it budded, it blossomed, and its clusters ripened into grapes. Pharaoh's cup was in my hand, and I took the grapes and squeezed them into the cup for him." Joseph explained the dream. "The 3 branches are 3 days. Within 3 days, Pharaoh will restore you to your position, and you will put his cup in his hand, just as you used to do." And he added, "Please, when you are back in favor, remember me and mention me to Pharaoh. Try to get me out of prison. I have done nothing to deserve it." The cupbearer agreed. Then the baker described his dream. "On my head were 3 baskets of bread. In the top basket were baked goods for Pharaoh, but the birds kept flying down to eat them." Joseph interpreted the dream. "The 3 baskets are 3 days. Within 3 days, Pharaoh will hang you on a tree, and the birds will eat away your flesh." The baker looked at him doubtfully. Now, Pharaoh's birthday was in 3 days' time, and he gave a feast for all his officials. He ordered the release of the chief cupbearer and the royal baker from prison. Then he summoned them to court and gave the cupbearer back his old job, but told the baker that he would be hanged, just as Joseph had said. Sadly, the cupbearer was so happy to be restored to his position that he forgot to tell Pharaoh about Joseph's plight. How could I sin against God? Understanding the story. Joseph proves his good character by repelling the advances of his master's wife. Though Joseph is thrown into prison, God remains with him. Though the meanings of Joseph's own dreams have yet to be revealed, his interpretations of the cupbearer and baker's dreams come true. This suggests that in the future, Joseph's dreams will also come to pass. Pharaoh's dreams. 2 long years had passed and Joseph was still in prison. The chief cupbearer had forgotten about him completely, and far from home, there was no one else to spare Joseph a thought. Pharaoh's throne. Pharaoh had a lavish throne for religious ceremonies and other special occasions. The throne represented his power and authority, and it was often placed on a higher step or level to show the lofty position of the ruler. This ornate gold-plated example was discovered in the treasures of the boy king Tutankhamun's tomb. One night in the royal palace, Pharaoh had a strange dream. He was on the banks of the Nile, and 7 sleek, well-fed cows waded out of the water and began to graze among the bulrushes. Then 7 more cows followed them out of the water. But these poor creatures were gaunt, and their ribs stuck out pitifully from their hides. They opened their starving mouths and ate all 7 of the sleek, fat cows. That same night, Pharaoh had another dream. 7 ears of plump, healthy corn were growing on a single stalk. Then another 7 ears of corn sprouted, but these were scorched and shriveled, and they devoured the 7 healthy ears of corn. Pharaoh was troubled. He could not understand what his dreams meant, but knew that they were important. He sent for the royal dream interpreter, who was much revered and practiced in such matters, but even he was baffled. Then Pharaoh issued a decree, summoning all the wise men in Egypt. They came from far and wide and listened to Pharaoh's dreams, but they too were perplexed. Then the chief cupbearer suddenly remembered the young Joseph, who had interpreted his dream so perfectly a long time ago in prison, and he felt bad that he had forgotten Joseph for so long. He told Pharaoh, and Joseph was released from prison and summoned to court. Joseph bowed down before Pharaoh, who said, "I had a dream, and no one can explain it, but I have heard it said that when you hear a dream, you can interpret it." "I cannot do it," replied Joseph, "but God will give Pharaoh the answer he desires." So Pharaoh told Joseph about his dreams, and Joseph explained that they were the same dream. They had been sent by God in 2 different forms because the message they contained was so important. The 7 good cows are 7 years, and the 7 good ears of corn are the same 7 years. The 7 thin cows that came up afterward and the 7 worthless ears of corn are the next 7 years. Joseph said that 7 years of great plenty would come to Egypt, but that 7 years of famine would follow. And he warned Pharaoh, "The abundance in the land will not be remembered, because the famine that follows will be so severe." And he went on to advise Pharaoh that he should find a wise man and put him in charge to make sure that during the good years, 1/5 of the harvest was saved and stored so that there would be enough food when the famine came. Pharaoh was impressed by Joseph's words. "Can we find anyone like this man?" he asked. "Someone with the Spirit of God? Since God has made all this known to you, there is no one more discerning or wise than you. You shall be in charge of my palace, and all my people are to submit to your orders. You will be my second in command. I hereby put you in charge of the whole of Egypt." With that, Pharaoh took off his signet ring and put it on Joseph's finger. He dressed him in fine robes and placed a gold chain around his neck, and together they rode in a magnificent chariot, Joseph by Pharaoh's side, for all to see. Just as Joseph had predicted, 7 years of plenty followed, and the fertile land, watered by the Nile, produced food in abundance. The fields were full of wheat and barley. The fruit trees groaned with figs and pomegranates, and the vines were heavy with the sweetest grapes. Joseph traveled all over the country, making sure that a good portion was stockpiled and saved for the bad years that he knew lay ahead. Huge quantities of grain were stored in granaries in every town and city. Then, after 7 years, the Nile dried up, the land shriveled and shrank back into itself, and the relentless famine began. But although the crops failed year after year, there was food for everybody in Egypt, and thanks to Joseph, no one went hungry. Pharaoh's chariot. Joseph had the honor of riding with Pharaoh in his chariot, a remarkable change in his fortunes. Royalty and high-ranking officials traveled in style in ceremonial chariots such as the one above, which belonged to Tutankhamun. Drought record. The famine stela discovered on Sahel Island in the Nile River recorded information about a 7-year drought and famine that affected ancient Egypt while Pharaoh Djoser was on the throne, circa 2686 to 2667 BCE. The 7-year famine ties in with Pharaoh's dreams. Understanding the story. Pharaoh's disturbing dreams are of particular significance because the Egyptians believed that their nation's fate depended on the Pharaoh's fate. When Pharaoh's own dream interpreter cannot tell him the meaning of his dreams, Joseph can. Joseph makes it clear that it is God who is providing the answer. The Pharaoh. The Bible gives no clues to the identity of the Pharaoh in the story of Joseph. The most famous Pharaoh was Ramesses II, ruled 1279 to 1213 BCE, who erected more statues of himself than any other king. So Pharaoh said to Joseph, "I hereby put you in charge of the whole land of Egypt." Then Pharaoh took his signet ring from his finger and put it on Joseph's finger. He dressed him in robes of fine linen and put a gold chain around his neck. He made him ride in a chariot as his second in command, and people shouted before him, "Make way." Genesis 41:41 through 43. Famine. This sad statue of a desperate man begging was discovered in Egypt and dates from the Middle Kingdom, 2040 to 1640 BCE. When the water levels of the Nile dropped, the crops could not flourish and many people starved to death. Joseph was now the powerful governor of Egypt. Joseph the governor. Famine gripped the land, spreading from country to country. Soon it arrived in Canaan, which Joseph had left so many years before. His aged father, Jacob, had heard the rumor that there were great mountains of grain far away in Egypt. So 10 of Joseph's brothers made the long journey to Egypt, but the youngest, who was named Benjamin, stayed at home with his father. Now, although they did not know it, their brother Joseph was the most important governor in all Egypt and was in charge of selling grain. When the brothers arrived, Joseph recognized them. He did not let on, however, and asked them where they came from. "From the land of Canaan," they replied nervously, not recognizing him. "You are spies," Joseph accused them. "You have come to snoop and pry." "No, my lord," they protested. "We were 12 brothers, all the sons of one father who lives in Canaan. The youngest is now with our father, and one brother is no more." "I don't believe you. I think you're spies," retorted Joseph. "But I will test whether you are lying or not. You will not leave unless your youngest brother comes here. One of you must go and get him. The rest of you will stay here in prison. Then we will see if you are telling the truth." But for the time being, he put them all in prison. After 3 days, Joseph went to them, relenting slightly. "If you really are honest, as you say, one of you can stay here and the rest can go back home and take grain to your starving household. But then you must bring back your youngest brother to prove that you are telling the truth." The brothers looked at each other, bewildered. "This must be some kind of punishment for what we did to our brothers so long ago," they said. Reuben, the kindest of the brothers, who had pleaded with the others to spare Joseph's life, said, "Didn't I tell you not to sin against that boy?" Deeply moved, Joseph turned away from them to hide his tears. When he had composed himself, he turned back and chose Simeon to be held in prison. Then he gave orders for their bags to be filled with grain and for the silver they had brought with them to be hidden amongst it. He also arranged for food to be given to them for their journey. The brothers loaded up their donkeys and set off for Canaan. When they stopped to rest that night, one brother opened his sack to give his donkey a few handfuls of grain, and he found the piece of silver buried there. He showed it to the others in amazement, and they looked at each other uncertainly and said, "What does this mean?" They continued their journey and at last arrived in Canaan. As they were emptying their bags, they found the silver hidden in each one, and they shivered with fear, not knowing what was going on. They told their father, Jacob, the whole story and begged him to let them take their youngest brother Benjamin back to Egypt, but Jacob, distraught at the thought of losing him, refused. Understanding the story. The power balance has shifted, and Joseph, governor of Egypt, is now in charge. Joseph forces his brother to confront their past and each other so they can all be reconciled. Simeon's detention in Egypt reminds the brothers of how they treated Joseph. The story proves that it is never too late to change direction. Though the brothers were jealous and aggressive, they see the error of their ways. Recording harvest. Grain gathered at harvest time was stored in large granaries, with clerks given the job of noting and documenting the stock. This clerk, part of a larger frieze, is writing down the annual harvest tally so all records are kept up to date. Joseph orders Simeon to be taken to prison. Didn't I tell you not to sin against that boy? Benjamin. Jacob had 12 sons, but his favorite was the youngest. Benjamin, meaning son of my right hand, was the only one born in Israel. His father predicted great things for Benjamin's descendants, who went on to form a tribe called the Benjamites. King Saul of the Old Testament and Paul of the New Testament were the best known Benjamites. Silver cup. To steal a silver cup was a major crime in ancient Egypt. Silver was a highly prized and relatively rare metal compared to gold, which was more readily available. Silver supplies were limited because the metal was imported into Egypt from Syria. This theft was particularly serious because the cup was the property of Joseph. As the Pharaoh's deputy, he was the second most important person in Egypt. Silver bowl. This ancient Egyptian bowl dates from 3rd to 1st century BCE. It shows a daisy in its center surrounded by petals or leaves, which was a typical decoration style for containers in this period. The silver cup. The famine continued, and, in time, the grain that Jacob's sons had brought from Egypt had run out. Jacob wanted his sons to go back again to buy more, but Judah reminded him that this time they would have to take their youngest brother Benjamin. They had made a promise to Joseph, the governor of Egypt. "Why did you tell him that you had a young brother in the first place?" grumbled Jacob, who was very fond of his young son. "He asked all about us and our family," his sons protested. "He wanted to know if our father was still alive and if we had another brother. How were we to know he would insist we brought our brother to him?" Then Judah spoke to his father. "I myself would guarantee Benjamin's safety. If I don't bring him back, I will bear the blame all my life." Reluctantly, his father agreed. "So be it. But you must keep on the right side of this governor. Take gifts with you and take twice as much silver this time, for you must return the silver you found in your sacks, and take your brother. May God Almighty grant you mercy." When the brothers arrived in Egypt, they presented themselves to Joseph. As soon as Joseph saw Benjamin, he said to his chief steward, "Take these men to my house, slaughter an animal, and prepare a feast. They will eat with me at noon." The brothers could not understand why they were being treated with such favor. Perhaps it was a trick and they were going to end up as slaves? And then the steward brought in Simeon, who had been left behind in prison, and the brothers threw their arms around him, relieved that he was safe. Joseph arrived, and bowing low, the brothers gave him the gifts from Canaan. He received them graciously, but could not take his eyes off Benjamin. Unlike the others, Benjamin and he shared the same mother, and they were real brothers. Tears welled in Joseph's eyes at the sight of him, but he pulled himself together and ordered the food to be served. It was a feast, but the brothers were astonished, as Benjamin was given 5 times as much as anybody else. Afterward, Joseph gave instructions for their sacks to be filled with food and grain, and for their pieces of silver to be hidden amongst it. And then he ordered that his own special silver cup should be put in Benjamin's sack. The brothers headed home, but had not gone far before Joseph's chief steward caught up with them, accusing them of stealing his master's silver cup. The brothers protested their innocence. "Why would we steal silver or gold from your master's house? If any one of us is found to have it, he will die, and the rest of us will become your lord's slaves." Gladly they opened their sacks, and the steward peered inside them. When he saw the silver cup in Benjamin's sack, he pulled it out and brandished it high in the air. The brothers looked at Benjamin in disbelief. They returned to Joseph's house. "How can we prove our innocence?" asked Judah sadly. "We are all your slaves." "No," answered Joseph. "Only the man who had the cup will be my slave. The rest of you must return to your father." Judah pleaded with him, explaining how precious Benjamin was to their father. "Please let me stay here as your slave in place of Benjamin. How can I go back to my father if he is not with me?" At this, Joseph broke down. He sobbed, "I am Joseph, your brother Joseph, the one you sold into Egypt. But don't be angry with yourselves. It was to save lives that God sent me ahead of you. It was not you who sent me here, but God." And he gave them a message for their father. "God has made me lord of all Egypt. Come here to me. You shall live in the region of Goshen, you, your children, and your grandchildren, your flocks and herds, and all you have. I will provide for you because 5 years of famine are still to come." When Jacob heard the news, he could not believe that his beloved son Joseph was still alive, and he was now the governor of Egypt and was offering the family refuge. He exclaimed, "My son Joseph is alive. I will go and see him before I die. It was to save lives that God sent me ahead of you. It was not you who sent me here, but God." Understanding the story. Joseph recognizes that his rise to power in Egypt was God's will all along. As his family gathered together and his brothers proved themselves to be changed men, Joseph remembers his past dream. It all becomes clear. The stars and sheaves of corn represented the 11 brothers now working for him. Again, his dream comes to pass.